Welcome back to the Haunting Hour. The next story I'm going to share is a ghost story called The Coffin. Now my granddaddy told me this story, and it comes from New Orleans. And in New Orleans, there's ghosts walking around everywhere. Now what happened was that he went to his neighbors and he saw the most peculiar thing. It was a coffin laying up at the side of the shack. And it had shelves in it, like it was a regular old cabinet. So he's staring at this coffin and he's thinking, now why would a coffin be used like a cabinet? And the neighbor that he was spending time with looked at him and said, you want to know the story behind that coffin? My granddaddy, he said, yeah, tell me. So the story goes way back when this man, who's now old, was little. He was spending time at his grandparents, and it was his granddaddy, his grandmommy, himself, and his sister. And they were sitting inside, and they were just sitting in their living room talking and telling stories, when all of a sudden their front door burst open. And 4 men carrying a coffin walked into their living room, stared him in the face, and put down the coffin. The 4 men stared at them again, and they walked out. Well, now this family is sitting there thinking, what is going on? There's a coffin in the middle of our living room. And they didn't know who those 4 men were who brought the coffin in. So they were very, very scared. But they didn't know what to do because there's a coffin just laying in their living room. So finally, the grandfather, he stands up and he says, if God help me, I'm going to open this up and find out what is inside. So the man, he lifts the coffin lid, and the coffin lid was already loose. So he lifts it up, and all 4 of them, they peer in, and there's a little girl laying there, and she was not dead. She had color in her face, her hair was still a mess but curled, and she was breathing deep breaths, but she was laying in the coffin. So the grandfather and the grandmother, they picked up this little girl and they put her on the couch, and they were twisting their thumbs. They didn't know what to do. How could a little girl be alive in a coffin that these 4 strange men brought into their living room? So they waited a minute, and the next thing they knew, the little girl, she sat up and she looked around, just alive as ever. And she was scared now because she didn't know where she was. She didn't know who these people were. She didn't know who this living room was. The last thing that she knew, she was at home asleep. So the grandmother and the grandfather, they went and got her some warm milk, and they went and got her some soup. And the grandmother said, oh, now you sweet little girl, don't you worry. Don't you be afraid. We'll get to the bottom of this. And finally the little girl, scared and sheepish, she explained to them, a couple nights ago, she was just at home and she went to sleep, and now the next thing she knew, she's in this strange people's living room. She said she only lived about 15 miles out of New Orleans, and she knew how to get home. So they all went to sleep, and then they woke up the next morning, and the grandmother and the grandfather put the little girl in their car and drove them that 15 miles to her home. Well, now this is where the story gets even worse, because when they got to the little girl's home, everybody was in mourning. Everyone's wearing black. The mirrors inside the house are covered so you can't look in them, just like a pure house in mourning. And the parents were all aflutter because they had just buried their daughter, and here she's standing in front of them. Well, they had to get to the bottom of this, so they sent their younger son out to the graveyard where they had just buried their daughter, and wouldn't you know it, with God as their witness, that coffin was empty.